Let's go to Ed from Wausau. Hi, Ed.
Hi. I was just talking to my aunt this last weekend who's been in Florida for too long, 30 years. But she admitted to me, she's like 80 and I'm 65, but she admitted to me that she's prejudiced. And that's one of the things that, puts her where she is. But on C-SPAN, during the West Virginia, I guess the state Republican Party was doing the swift voting of Obama with the ads using Reverend Wright. I guess the National Party tried to keep them from doing that, but they did do that. And also, I wonder if there's any effect. I was wondering what the effect was of, I guess, Rush Limbaugh's had a campaign to convince Republicans to switch over and vote as Democrats for Hillary. But if you could comment on those two.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. Professor Lowndes, you want to start?
Yeah, let me start with the latter one first. I think a lot has been made about this idea of getting Republicans to switch over and register Democratic and vote for Clinton. I think that takes a lot of effort and time, even for people to get to the polls and vote once, and to register at all takes a lot of time and energy. And the idea of getting large numbers of people, enough to make it matter, the thousands of people necessary to do that, I think is unlikely. I did before I was a political science professor. I worked in a democracy reform organization that looked at election and election fraud a lot, and I think that kind of thing just rarely happens. There's not evidence of those kind of concerted mass efforts. In terms of the first question about the swift voting of Obama through the use of Reverend Wright, I wonder if I was really surprised. It was interesting to see how pundits spoke about Jeremiah Wright the first time he came out. Everybody said this is going to sink Obama, or this is going to be really, and then it turned out that it did not seem to hurt him terribly in the polls in Pennsylvania, although you can't entirely trust how people respond to polls. But it didn't do the damage that people thought it did. And then, as if to test that very proposition, Jeremiah Wright comes out again and says, in case you didn't understand me, here's underline my position.
Really?
And, that also, then people thought for sure this was going to really do it to Obama. And it seemed to also not have as much, it certainly had effects and will have lingering effects, but they weren't quite as strong as I think most journalists, pundits, and even political scientists, I think, thought that it would be. And it makes me wonder, in a way, I don't think, and people don't want to let Wright off the hook or Obama off the hook for his connection to him, but I'm not sure that, the question is, are these the sentiments that animate voters right now? And I think, during the 80s, there was a lot of issues of crime, issues of welfare, issues of affirmative action, which Republicans stoked, and Democrats began stoking too. DLC Democrats really had a lot of play in the electorate, and certainly we all, with the Willie Horton ad from the first George Bush's campaign is an example of this. But it makes me wonder how much Wright will end up mattering. And I'm not sure that it will matter as much as people have assumed it has, in part because I'm not sure that race is the central concern to voters in a way that it was in the immediate post-civil rights era.
Well, that's a good question. Let's ask that of Professor Voss. What do you think animates voters now?
Well, I don't think there have really been that many changes over the last couple of generations. The number one things that voters respond to are the conditions they see in their communities. What we have a little term for is jargon, retrospective voting. But what it means is they sort of look back at what they've experienced over the last 2 to 4 years, and if they feel like things are getting better, they tend to vote for the party that's in power, and if things are getting worse, they tend to vote against them. Economics is the most powerful. When you have a foreign policy engagement like this, foreign policy can creep in and mess around with that calculus. I really don't think that's any different. What changes is the details. In other words, what sort of crisis is bothering them and who does it bother? Today we have one that hasn't been around again in almost a political generation, which is these gas prices.
Yes.
And the inflation that's starting to result in the price of little things like noodles or cans of vegetables.
Right.
And I think that's going to be motivating people now, same way it was motivating them back in the late 70s and early 80s.
Do you want to add to that or detract from it, Professor Lowndes?
Well, I think that Professor Voss is right. The question is how people understand and interpret their conditions, which I think can differ. I mean, each party has what their role is to interpret and frame for voters how they're experiencing their conditions and what are the causes of it. And so, at certain moments in political history, FDR was able to lay the Depression at the feet of conservative Republicans and Herbert Hoover in particular. Reagan by 1980 was able to point to the myriad economic problems and say, look, this is the legacy of democratic liberalism, and convince voters that their interests, therefore, were Republican interests. So I do think that it's not simply how people understand what their conditions are, but how they interpret those conditions, and partly that's a question of language and a question of how people understand the world around them, which I think is not just simply empirical. It's about interpretation.